Today we're working on an iPhone 8 volume/power flex replacement. This will replace several different things on the device, so if you have any of these issues, this is your repair. Power button, rear mic, flash, mute switch, volume up and volume down. I get this particular part from Mobile Centrics. It's only a few dollars. They're great. I almost never have any issues. I highly suggest them. But you just as easily can get them from, I don't know, eBay or some other random parts vendor. I prefer Mobile Centrics. The tools we'll need: and there's one on here that's not entirely necessary, but it helps greatly. We have the Phillips Pentalobe tweezers, opening tool, nylon spudger, the standoff bit. A flathead will work almost the same. It'll get the job done. One of these from iFixit will make your life significantly easier, and they're only a few bucks. You'll also need, as you have to replace the battery, assuming you don't want your battery rattling around after the repair, double-sided tape. I use Tessa, but I mean, in all reality, any sort of tape will do. I think this is a must, but a magnetic mat will make your life significantly easier. I do this in one stretch, but it certainly helps if somebody knocks into your table or your working surface. Screws don't get mixed up. If you need to, I don't know, if you don't have a dedicated desk, you're doing this at a kitchen table, it's easy, you can pick it up. I've shown this in some of my other videos, but when I first started repairs, I didn't have a magnetic mat, so I used packing tape. Works pretty much the same. You can set screws on it, and they don't move. But if you do this often, I'd highly suggest a magnetic mat. And last but not least, rubbing alcohol. 91% or better. It helps with the removal of the battery tabs tremendously. Once again, it's not necessary. If you use extreme caution, you can get out the battery tabs, all 4 of them, but I've found, I do this for a living, and as soon as I heard about this tool, it has made battery removal significantly easier, especially in repairs where you reuse the battery, like the 8, and I guess not like the 8, it would be any repair where you have to use the battery, specifically the power flex that we are replacing today. So let's get started. I also forgot to mention this, but a heat source will help out with removing the old flex. There is some adhesive. Obviously, this is the new part, but there's some adhesive along here. I mean, keep in mind if you are replacing it and you damage the old one, that's not the end of the world because you're obviously replacing it. But as a general rule, I try to be as light-handed as possible. The phone I have today is just a prop, but for the sake of the repair, for the sake of the video, just need to see how it's done. I always start from this particular corner out of habit. The trick that I have is I run, you can sort of see, assuming you I run along this line right here, makes removing the screen. It helps out. You want to avoid, pretty much the only part you want to avoid is using too much force. The LCD and home button flex cable from the screen is right here. The last thing, obviously you're reusing the screen, you have to take it off for this particular repair, but you want to obviously be able to reuse it. So be very careful around this particular area. You don't want to accidentally sever the flex cables. My trick for removing the screen is you want to sort of twist at a downward angle like this. If it's fighting you, this is where the heat would come in, and your heat, or the adhesive is all along the perimeter. Typically the only place that it gives you any sort of grief or puts up any sort of fight is along the top and the bottom. The technique that I use is setting the screws in the same cluster as they would appear, ideally next to the retaining plates that they came out of. I've done so many of these, I have it down to memory. But for all of you out there who don't do this for a living, that's where the magnetic mat helps, as you're not going to misplace them. Vitally important whenever you are connecting or disconnecting anything from the device, you always want to disconnect the battery first. Literally the first thing that you should do is always disconnecting the battery. Last thing you want to do is short out part of the motherboard, and then you'd have much bigger problems than just replacing your flex cable. The safe area, there are components along the top and the bottom of the flex cable. I suggest lifting up with either your fingernail or with a spudger right here. Same goes with the flex cable, the front-facing camera flex cable. There's some components right here, tiny little capacitors, filters, but the safe area is right here. Take your screen, set it aside. The next step is to remove the main logic board. You have a screw right there. Lift it up at an angle. Comes right out. Next is the, almost forgot, the piece right there. Some screws aren't as magnetic as others. For whatever reason, these 4 screws aren't as magnetic. So sometimes you have to use tweezers to grab them. This one is the standoff bit, but like I said, you just as easily can use a flathead. Just be careful, they tend to slip. Just like the packing tape trick that I used when I started repairing phones many years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. I used a flathead, not knowing that that particular tool even existed, that bit existed. If you do this fairly regularly, it's worth investing. iFixit has a kit. I want to say it's somewhere in the $40 to $60 range for their really nice one. Onto the rear camera. You can use your spudger or your flex cable. Lift straight up. So depending on how quickly you intend to fix this repair or how long it actually ends up taking, something to consider is if this is something that the phone is going to sit out overnight, you might want to cover up and put the rear camera and or the housing in a plastic bag of some sort, or basically just want to cover it up, because the last thing that you want, no matter how, even if you're not in a dusty area, I've seen it before where the camera is left out or dust gets on the inside of the lens, and you put everything back together and then you want to take a picture and it's blurry or there are spots, and obviously that's the last thing you want, because at that point you'd have to take the whole thing apart again, which I have done many times. Not fun. Next we have the Power Flex. Once again, you can see, I don't know if you can see this very well, but obviously there are many components right here. Ideally, you want to lift right here, straight up. This is one of your antennas. Normally, this particular piece is covered up with, this particular screw is covered up with foam. I've already taken this phone apart in a previous video. Do not forget it. If you fail to take out this screw, when you go to lift it out, you just as easily could crack the motherboard. Once again, gonna have a bad day. Don't do that. These two flex cables, obviously you've already removed the battery. These two flex cables, the charging port and the flex cable that goes down here, which is the NFC antenna, are relatively simple. Lift straight up, use your fingernail or use a spudger. The QI wireless charger is slightly harder to get to. That's why I suggest using tweezers. Ideally, you want to position your tweezers. You want them to end up in the lower right corner. Pop it straight up. Easy peasy. Use a paper clip or a SIM removal tool, or just something long like this to remove the SIM card tray. There is a little pin. If you don't stick that back in its little slot, it makes the board removal slightly more difficult than it needs to be, so make sure not to forget. For the board, MLB main logic board, we have two standoff screws. Remove those. The board pops out. Simple as that. Set the board aside. Same deal as the rear camera and the lens. If you don't get around to doing this in a reasonable period of time, once again, dust, debris can get in the connectors, and well, I doubt it'll wreak all kinds of havoc, but it will certainly I've seen certain issues where dust gets in the way and you'll have certain issues. I had one recently where the one particular line of touch on the screen wasn't nearly as functional. I ended up having to clean out the particular connector. So put this in a plastic bag or set it upside down. Ideally, don't leave it out overnight. The next step after this is to remove the battery. I find the easiest way is to remove the Taptic engine, which allows easier access to the battery strips, the adhesive strips. If you do this, you'll need one more tool that I forgot about in the beginning of the video, which is a tri-wing or tri-point for this screw right here. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. The repair can still be done. It's just significantly easier to remove the battery adhesive strips. You're less likely to tear the strips during removal if you're able to remove the Taptic engine for easier access. This little part right here, this flex cable, has some adhesive. Just like with everything else, you don't want to be too heavy-handed. Usually what I do is either stick your tweezers in. If you don't feel safe doing that, you just as easily can use the flat end of your spudger. Drive it in there as a wedge, ever so slightly, till it comes loose. Lift up. Now you can do this one of a couple of ways. One is to remove the battery strips with the Taptic engine sort of hanging off here. I'm human, I'm imperfect. Every once in a while I've done this and I've accidentally torn the flex clean off of the Taptic engine. If you want to play it safe, which I will do for this video, you're best to remove the Taptic engine and set aside temporarily. This is a slightly tricky part. This is where the rubbing alcohol comes in. Some of the older models you would heat up the adhesive, but the adhesive in this particular model is much closer to command strips. I'll show you with and without. You'll feel some resistance, but it comes right out. If I'm making this look easy, it's because I've done this, I don't know, thousands of times. Usually I do the lower right strip last. For whatever reason, this one tends to tear the most often. These particular strips up top are slightly more difficult, but not much. It's easiest if you can remove these tabs off of the top of the battery. If you don't, as you can see, this one is getting torn. Be gentle as much as you can. If you have rubbing alcohol, get something to This is what this little dropper is for. Obviously, I don't buy it like this. I buy it by the gallon. I buy 99%. And ideally, you want just 1 or 2 drops. I gently pull until it comes out. You don't have to pull at a 90-degree angle. You just as easily can pull off to the side. Here's the last one. Notorious lower right. Lift up on the tab. This one came out just fine. They're not very long. And all the older models, before the wireless charger came around, the strip ran the entire length. There's 2 of them. They would run from here to here. On the models 8 and newer with wireless chargers, the strips don't run nearly as long. Later in the video, when I reinstall the battery, I'll show you if any of you have purchased a battery or if you have battery adhesive. There are adhesives that you can get that match up perfectly. They're not necessary. You can use, like I said, any sort of double-sided tape. But if you have a preference of one over the other, you can install the Taptic engine now, or any point for that matter. I'm going to do it now. Remember, this flex cable sits on top of the Taptic engine. We have one standoff screw. There's a slightly elaborate setup. Where the Taptic engine connects to the charging ports. It's not the easiest to get to. You can bend back this. It's not as fragile as you might think. Good Lord. Once that's in place, put your 3 screws back in. Once again, this screw in the upper right is your only tri-wing. Now on to the power flex, power volume flex. As you can see, there are adhesive strips along here. The only one we need to concern ourselves with is the one covering the volume buttons. As you can see, there are 3 screws on the left side, 2 on the right. Three more for this antenna. There is a standoff screw immediately underneath right here. You can use heat if you don't feel comfortable. Use a blow dryer of some sort or just a heating source. But you just as easily can use the flat end of your spudger. There's a retaining plate held down with a small standoff screw. Lift it out. Lift out the retaining plate. And we're done. Now once again, there's 2 ways to remove. You can use heat. If you plan to reuse the flex cable because you're doing a housing replacement. If you get a bare housing, you need to swap all these parts over. Obviously be as gentle as possible. Another reason you might need to reuse this particular flex is if you have issues with the buttons or the switch. I'm not too far away from a military base, Camp Pendleton, and let's just say a lot of the Marines get a bunch of crap and debris in the mute switch, on the mute switch, to the point where it has absolutely no movement, up or down movement. So essentially their switch stops working. If this happens to you and you need to remove this, I mean, worst case scenario, it's not a very expensive part, but obviously if you don't have to buy a part and you can reuse yours, that's ideal. And that's your flex. More often than not, the flex assembly that you purchase, as you can see, mine does not come with the mute switch, so that needs to be transferred over. Try not to get ahead of yourself. The last thing you want to do is put the phone back together only to realize that you don't have a mute switch. There are, I'll try to get this on camera. There are, I don't know what you would call these, 2 little sort of spring-like tabs that you lift up on both sides. And then you sort of wiggle the switch out just like so. Don't be afraid to, once again, if you're replacing this, don't be afraid to manhandle it. If you're replacing it, who cares? You're not going to damage this piece of metal. If anything, you're going to damage the flex. when you transfer the switch, you want to make sure that the red line right there faces up. Or in this particular scenario, as you can see, it faces towards me. We have these little arms. And I'll do my best to do this in slow motion. It's kind of small. The spring clips that hold it in are right here and here. This is giving me some resistance. This is difficult to hold. Push straight down. Now the tricky thing at this point is you need to get the switch up and over. As you can see right here, you need to align this hole in the center with your plastic switch that actually does the work. It may take you 1 or 2 tries. If you need to remove the switch because it's not aligned properly, or if it's off kilter, if the switch is sitting one way or the other, the trick that I use is to lift up gently on these spring clips, just a few degrees, just to give you some room, wiggle it, realign it, and once you're done, so this is the old one I'll use as an example, they're fairly resilient. Once they're done, once you've aligned it properly, push them down. If you get it right the first time, no need to realign. Once that's done, time for reassembly. I find it easiest to install one side or the other. Usually I install the volume mute switch side first. You also want to be careful. The clicking, this little black dot is what makes your button volume up or down. Click. You want to make sure not to over tighten the middle screw. As if you over tighten it, the metal buttons can tear that black piece, that black button right here off, and then you have to buy a new cable. Once it's in, usually I start by leaving these two not all the way tightened. Then I tighten the left all the way. Check by clicking, then tighten the middle, make sure it clicks properly. Then I Tighten the last screw for the switch. Make sure that tightens properly. If it's not done properly, unscrew a couple turns. Realign till it's just right. At this point, it's time to remove the adhesive. Just like with all flex cables, be gentle. Now the adhesive isn't so strong that you can't remove it, but ideally, I forgot something. Covering the flash. It's not so strong that you can't remove it with some heat. You take this, fold it 90 degrees. Your power button should look something like that. The little metal bracket. Something I will note, I've seen this on eBay, different vendors. If you have the option of buying the flex cable with the metal bracket, I would highly, highly, highly suggest buying it with the bracket. You can technically buy just the flex cable, no metal bracket. The process of separating the old from the new is just an absolute nightmare. Pay, I don't know however many dollars it is. It's not much. Pay the few extra dollars and do yourself a favor. I repair thousands of devices a year, and I'm telling you, it is absolutely not worth the work you're gonna have to do to transfer over these metal brackets. The only time I've ever gotten them is when I blindly order parts and get them accidentally. I literally send them back. It's ridiculous. Don't do it. There is an alignment pin for the rear mic. You can see right there an alignment pin is this little plastic piece right here. You have some leeway. I mean, obviously the hole is tiny, but the hole here is slightly bigger. If it's not lined up perfectly, if it doesn't want to immediately stick in place, don't worry. That's what this retaining bracket is for. Take your standoff screw. It goes in the... Your standoff screw goes right here. This is one of the ones that's not so magnetic friendly. Good Lord, I keep dropping it. It's relatively simple to tighten down, and then your other two holes are misaligned. If that happens, unscrew half a turn and realign it. Doesn't have to be exact. You'll notice it when you start screwing, installing the rest of the components, but it's best to get it done right now. Now you can do one of a couple of things. You can install this antenna right now, or you can install the logic board, which is my suggestion. It's sort of a pain to fold this antenna up. So usually what I do is I install the antenna after the main logic board is installed. Something I will point out is, I see this as a common mistake sometimes. You want this little piece to sit on top of the logic board, not below. There's a standoff screw that goes here. The second one goes right by the speaker. With most of the wider flex cables, I usually suggest pressing down on the left side to right side or right side to left side. With the smaller ones, when you're reconnecting, just press in the dead center. Kind of hard to mess up. Flex cables in general are a sort of feel over sight. Once you get it in the general area, in this case, obviously you can see my finger covers the flex cable completely. You want to be as light as possible. I've seen people that do this themselves, and they will press too hard, use too much force. If you damage, which can happen, one of a couple of things can happen. One is you damage the flex cable. Well, you're out a few bucks, $8 or $10 or whatever. Two is you damage the actual connector, and one is significantly more expensive of a repair than the other. Once we have that, you don't have to do this in any particular order. I reinstall the SIM card tray, reconnect. I'll do this with that way you can see better. The wireless charging cable is relatively narrow. It has a tendency to tilt to one side or the other. Just make sure you hear it click. The charging port is wide enough. It's one of the few cables, LCD and charging port flex cable, are wide enough that you just as easily can press down one side without pressing down the other if you press dead center, in which case your phone might not charge. A variety of things might not happen. I mean, essentially your charging port has all of these connectors down here: Taptic engine, charging port, lower 2 microphones, your speaker, NFC. If you, for whatever reason, don't install the charging port flex all the way, you could be left with any one of those problems. If that happens, pretty much the easiest thing to do is lift up. If you see it sticking up on one side or the other, I'll use this as an example. It's almost easier to see it from this side. This is a classic example where you can see that there is a slight gap right there. This is what it looks like from that side, which isn't very helpful. It's much more helpful here. Make sure it's pressed down, and you're good to go. This particular flex connector is not my favorite. Like I said, with the first, pretty much all, you don't want to be too heavy-handed. If you are off by just a fraction of a millimeter, it makes this thing such a pain in the neck to get to. There we go. I don't know if that was audible on your end, but there's a little click. You feel it drop in place. Back in business. Now for reinstall. I'm getting ahead of myself. Don't forget your Phillips, the last screw for the logic board. Now for reinstall. This little piece right here, usually I start by screwing down one or all three. Usually I do one before moving on to this Phillips right here. This particular, I don't even know if you can tell by looking at it. I think it's easier to tell on a black screen. There is a noticeable downward curve. You want to make sure you're installing it properly. I don't know if you can catch that right there. You want to make sure you're installing it properly. Before installing the camera, you want to make sure to install this flex cable antenna. I'm getting ahead of myself before screwing it down all the way. Make sure it's lined up. Snap the connector in place. I mentioned this before when removing the camera, but you want to make sure that there is no dust on either the camera or camera lens. Drop it in place. We have our camera cover. Either one of these screws aren't going to be magnetically friendly. So as a general rule, I will use tweezers. I don't even bother trying to use my screwdriver to grab them. Before screwing that down all the way, I'll screw down the other side. That's the last time you're going to use your, assuming you followed in my exact steps in the exact order that I did, that's the last time you're going to use your standoff. Now, let me set this aside. We have a couple of options for reinstalling the battery. For my paying customers, I prefer to use the battery adhesive that comes with the device. It lines up exactly, as you can see, for a perfect fit. That doesn't come loose anytime soon, but I'm well aware that the average customer might not want to drop a bunch of coin on potentially unnecessary. So you just as easily, I use Tessa tape on iPads, but it works just as well on or any sort of double-sided tape. Ideally, stickier the better. I mean, keep in mind, your phone can heat up sometimes. I've seen customers that have done this in the past, or devices that I've repaired for customers that were previously owned by somebody else. They did the repair themselves, and they come to me saying, hey, my battery is rattling. As you can see, there's a little bit of room. There's a little bit of room that your battery can move around. I've seen it where the person puts an adhesive, there's just not enough, or not the right kind, or it comes loose over time. In my opinion, you're best using one of these if you have the option of, but this repair is intended for the average consumer, so we're going to use some basic double-sided tape. I guess this isn't basic double-sided tape. You really don't need that much. My suggestion, if you're going to do this, is to install the battery last, as if you install the battery off kilter, sometimes it's a pain in the neck to move this flex cable around just right. It's certainly easier, in my opinion, to reconnect the screen. This is one of the cables. Usually I press down from left to right, or right to left, rather than in the dead center. Connect the home button, flex, screen. Usually I push down left to right. Last but not least, connect your battery. After that, we put our flex cable, and some of these are just not very friendly with magnetic screwdrivers when they're on a magnetic mat. For any of you that might be saying, Spencer, you forgot your adhesive strips. I'm doing it this way intentionally. I prefer to bolt down all flex cables, specifically the battery flex cable, before removing the adhesive, as it, in my opinion, it's just the easiest way. It's, in my opinion, significantly easier to align the battery while it's connected. Apple says not to use. When I took Apple's course, they specifically kept saying don't use metal tools around battery. So I'm gonna keep in mind this is for the average non-professional technician. Use your spudger, something that's not sharp that you can accidentally poke it with. Lift up. You have a little bit of give with this particular battery flex. Doesn't have to be exact. Rest it in place. Push down firmly. So at this point we have screen, 2 pencil lobes, and we're done. Keep in mind, we need to get these into these grooves. It's not the easiest thing to get on camera. I'll try. I really can't. If you look closely, immediately here and here, there are these plastic stubs that will fit perfectly in here and here. Typically, I'll put in the upper right corner, then twist to insert the upper left. Assuming your screen is an aftermarket, if your screen is original, the flex cables won't be too long. They shouldn't extend outward, but I've seen it many times where the person's screen is too long. Just a tip, you want to make sure that this flex cable is not sitting in between this rail and your housing. I have seen it done before where customers or even technicians have pinched the cable. If you push too hard, when you pinch it, you can damage the screen and the home button, in which case you're going to have to buy a screen. So avoid that. Put in your 2 pencil lobe screws. And we're done. Thank you for watching.